Hey there, ladies and gentlemen. This is your friend Charlie Hunter in Bellows Falls, Vermont. Welcome to the Reasonably Fine Art Talk. We've got a wonderful guest today, one of the most impressive human beings I've met in the last few years. Our friend, Mr. Scott, is it Lothes?
Or it's Lotus, actually. Just forget about the H. It's just Lotus.
Really, just Lotus. Very transcendent sounding. Very
like
Buddhist.
The flower, like the sports car. Yeah, exactly.
Anyway, Scott Lothes of the Center for Railroad Photography and Art. And it's an organization in Madison, Wisconsin that I'm a member of, but I know precious little about. It does an annual conference in Illinois with freezing weather every year. That's a specialty.
That's true.
And you put out a publication, Railroad Heritage, that comes out 4 times a year or 6 times a year.
Yes, it's a quarterly. We do our quarterly journal, and then lately we've been doing a book every year as well, and we're on pace to continue with that trend too.
So tell us about the genesis of the organization and how you came to be involved in it.
Well, I'll try to do this within the allotted time that we have today. It's interesting because railroads and photography and really all forms of art have a long history, and railroads and photography particularly kind of grew up together. The steam railroads really started to come about in the late 1820s, and then you had the daguerreotype, the first commercially viable photographic process, in 1839. Basically a decade apart, and railroads were very early subjects for photographers. And then painters and artists of all stripes also started to approach the railroads. And the railroads really, I think they were one of those transformative technologies that kind of forced a shift in the dialogue in the art world. Before so many of the classically trained painters really focused on sweeping landscapes and royalty and nobility and landmarks and kind of common everyday industrial subjects weren't really considered to be appropriate topics for serious artists. But the Industrial Revolution and really powered so much by the steam railroad at that time, I think really changed some of that dialogue and encouraged artists to approach not only railroads, but industrial subjects, everyday people. And certainly that had been happening before, but I think it really was accelerated by the Industrial Revolution. And so you have this great history between the railroads and all the visual culture surrounding them. And we have lots of wonderful railroad museums and railroad organizations and scenic train rides all over the country. But there wasn't really any, and some wonderful railroad historical societies, but there wasn't really an organization that actually focused on railroads and the arts and the visual representations of them, which have been so prolific. And so our founder, a man named John Gruber, who passed away in 2018, he has been a freelance author and photographer for his entire life. He did lots of work for Trains magazine, which is kind of the foremost magazine in the field. He did freelance work for them. He did books. He worked for some historical societies. He worked for the Mid-Continent Railroad Museum. And you had something to add to that?
Yeah, he did one of my favorite books called Travel by Train. That's a history of the railroad poster. And
with Michael Zega, I believe.
Yes, that
as
is
a co-author on that. Yeah.
And boy, that book was such an inspiration to me when I was doing old time travel posters. I just
cool.
It's a great book.
They're just wonderful, aren't they? The posters are just fantastic.
Yeah. Anyway, continue. I
of course. No, quite all right. Feel free anytime. But John was on the board and deeply involved at the Mid-Continent Railroad Museum here in Wisconsin. And at the time, they had a photography and art committee that John was in charge of, and they had a publication. And this really seemed to have some legs and to be growing. And at some point, I think the activities of the photography and art committee just became so great that I think, and there were some other factors involved. David P. Morgan, the former editor of Train, still kind of a legendary figure in the railroad community. He really encouraged John that this community kind of needed a visually focused railroad organization. And so there were all these different factors coming together that led John to take the great step of creating this new nonprofit organization called the Center for Railroad Photography and Art.
And what year was that he created?
Yeah, the Articles of Incorporation were filed in 1997. So we'll be hitting our 25th anniversary next year, which is pretty exciting to think about. And, in the organization's early days, I mean, John built this thing from the ground up, literally on his dining room table with his wife Bonnie's gracious assistance in some of those early years. But John had some great, I mean, he was just he was a quiet person, but a tremendous people person. And he really made lots of deep relationships with many of the most influential photographers and artists and editors in the field. And he really leveraged those connections to put together some really fantastic early publications and traveling exhibitions. And got them into some pretty good venues, including Grand Central in New York and some other places all over the country that really kind of helped elevate the center's status and showed that we were serious about this, and then begin having those conferences in Chicago that you referenced, and getting people together and to have serious conversation. And they're a lot of fun, but we try to take it seriously and have fun too, and just to have a little bit more thought about the ongoing relationship between railroads and visual culture, and how we continue to approach that. And it was one of these things, one of our members, a good friend of mine named L. Ron Lawrence out in California, mentioned that in creating the center, John kind of had this Steve Jobs moment where he took something that we didn't know that we needed, and now we can't really live without it, at least
right.
within our little sphere. And we've had such tremendous support from our community. John put together a phenomenal board of directors that has continued to grow, and we bring in a lot of wonderful diversity through them, and many different backgrounds and perspectives and professionalism that just all aids in our kind of our approach and our perspectives on the railroads. And then we have a very passionate and dedicated membership who supports us very generously with their time, their effort, their finances, their artwork. All of this just helps us be able to grow and thrive to the point that we now have an archive of about 500,000, primarily photographs, but some paintings in that. The journal that you already mentioned. We've been doing 2 conferences a year, actually, one in Chicago and one regionally. During COVID, we've done everything online, but that's really worked out wonderfully. We've been able to expand our outreach through online webinars, both full-day events and single topics in the evenings. And even some of our traveling exhibits are still on the road. We've put together a wonderful staff of professionals that have been able to come in and provide some expertise in collections and fundraising and exhibition programming and things that
how'd you get pulled into it?
Well, I mean, trains have been an interest for me for my entire life. And I grew up in a little a river town in West Virginia called St. Albans. That's just outside of the state capital of Charleston. It's in the Kanawha River Valley, and it's a long and narrow town that's bounded by the river on one side and the mountains on the other. And the Chesapeake and Ohio Railway runs right through the middle of town. Cuts the town in half, and the tracks are actually up on a pedestal. So for most of it, it's the 6-track wide boulevard. There's 2 main tracks, 2 sidings on either side. There were these big cantilevered signal bridges that had, the red, green, and yellow lights on them. So the railroad was just a profound presence in the town where I grew up. And every day, my mom would drive me to my grandma's house, and we'd go up over this embankment and bounce across the tracks, and you'd look up and down and see those vanishing points going off to the horizon, right, and the signal lights glowing above them in each direction. And so like a lot of kids, I was interested in all things mechanical and big machines that moved. And trains were just something that really had a lasting influence and interest for me. And at the same time, I love to draw. I mean, from the first time I could hold a pencil, I was drawing, and I did that all the way through high school, and I got reasonably good at drawing mechanical things, but the natural world just kind of eluded me, and it was challenging for me to do the landscapes and the other elements I wanted in my pictures, in addition to the railroad, because I really like to explore those relationships between the technological of the railroad and then the natural world that it goes through. And so I ended up going to school for engineering up at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, thinking that I wanted to go build locomotives. And I got away from drawing at that time, lack of time and just not really having the skill set that I really felt like I wanted. But in the process of going to school there, I met a friend who was into photography and into trains, and I was kind of looking for a new creative outlet, and so I picked up a camera, and that's how photography started for me. And I was able to kind of use some of those compositional tools from drawing to try to influence my photographic work. And with the camera, you just pointed at something and it records exactly what you see. So I didn't have to worry about getting my trees and my rocks and my grasses just right. And so it was a good fit for me. And I started doing some freelance work for some of the railroad magazines. I ended up going to work for an engineering magazine after graduating from college. I never really was an engineer at heart, although I certainly have a great appreciation for the technological, but I've always been more interested in kind of what it means and how it's used and how it's applied and how we use it in the world. And at this engineering magazine, I really kind of found that I was very interested in writing and editing and page layout and graphics, and so much of the things on the publication side were far more interesting to me than the topics themselves. And so I kept doing that for a little while. There was my wife and I went off and taught English in Japan for 2 years and had a bit of a break from all of that. But the railroads were still a big part of my time there, and I did photography and did some articles about them while I was there and after I came back. And this all eventually led to getting involved at the center, first as a member, and then John had a grant to do a website and hired me to help work on that just as on an hourly basis when I was living out in Oregon after we got back when my wife did her graduate master's degree at Oregon State. And so that was kind of the start of my work for the center, and things have just grown since then. I came and presented at the conference and started organizing the year after that, and it just grew from there.
Now, one of the things I think is really interesting and bears thinking about is and it was one of the hesitancies I had about getting involved with a railroad art organization, is the ghettoization of the image, because it is viewed as railroad art as opposed similarly to wildlife art,
Sure.
And one of the things that I think is that I was surprised at in the organization was that I assumed that everybody there was just going to want to know if I'd gotten the right number of the rivet counting, got all the technical details. But there was there's a much greater sense of the poetics of both in the photography and art than I was necessarily expecting. Was that a conscious decision of John? Was that a part of Gruber's aesthetic? Is that a conscious thing you guys have talked about? I mean, because you've got, and we're going to put in the comments for the people watching who are not necessarily familiar with some of the figures we're going to talk about. You've got people, the tradition of railroad art came out of kind of Lucius Beebe and Charles Clegg doing what was called the three-quarter shot. This is my background for people watching. Three-quarter shot is the three-quarter view of a locomotive and train coming toward you. There are photographers, you did a book of Furler, Donald Furler, I believe.
Yes, exactly.
A fairly conventional, very skilled, but what he liked were fairly conventional railroad shots. Then and this is interesting, your thesis is basically that the railroad was kind of, it was the personification of the machine age. And so artists, whether photographers, writers, or painters, are referring back to that technological innovation. The train becomes kind of the metaphor for technology in a lot of song and visual stuff. You have photographers like, I would say Philip Hastings, Steinheimer, who start advancing the train as an element in a larger composition. So the railroad is still the dominant subject matter, but the photographs are of more than just the train. They're not pictures of trains. They are the train in an environment. Riff on that for me for a moment.
So it's interesting because I think there were sort of at least two different trajectories going on, and I think a lot of photographers, maybe not directly, but even at some point, I mean, there's been so much coverage of railroads by artists and painters in particular that I think as photographers we can't help but see what's going on in other media, and react to that to a certain extent. And in the art world, you had very much the opposite thing happen. You had, again, these painters that were trained in classical painting techniques that were really focused on the landscapes and the natural world, and all of a sudden you had trains coming into them. And so rather than start by doing these close-up three-quarter views of trains, these, particularly some of the painters in the Hudson River School began by taking the big sweeping landscape, and then down in the corner, there's, the little speck of the train with the, the wisp of steam coming up. And you see that throughout 19th century art. At first, the railroad is kind of this thing off in the distance, and then as artists became more comfortable, both with painting these subjects and just approaching them in general, you see the train take on a greater and greater source of prominence in these works. And in photography, we kind of had the opposite thing happen. And I think, partly there's just that mechanical concept of, people who I think are drawn to trains often have some great appreciation for the mechanical, and as you say, the personification of that in the train. And the camera is, a mechanical device that we're using for artistic purposes. And so there's some nice carryover between those. And there's, I think, just a great fascination of taking, this one mechanical device and using it to record an image of this other mechanical device. And so we really started out primarily with photographs of the equipment itself, and using the camera as a way of just recording our interest in these machines.
Right. So when do you know, historically, was there a lot of resistance that though the photographers who started to introduce the larger sense of place, did they run it? Was there resistance to that of like, we just want the picture of the Central Railroad of New Jersey Camelback coming toward us with good lighting? There was certainly dialogue that went on, and it was interesting. You mentioned Furler, and he was certainly someone. He was a mechanical engineer. He had a great appreciation for all things mechanical. He wanted views that showed the mechanical details of the locomotives, but also showed the action, the big plumes of steam and other things to show that these things were moving. And his son, Alan, was very generous, not only in donating his father's photography, but also in providing access to his correspondence. And he had letters with the early editors of Trains magazine in the 1940s. Al Kalmbach, the founder of Kalmbach Publishing, which publishes Trains, was their first editor. And there was some very interesting correspondence back and forth between them. When Furler would sometimes, complain about a certain image that, that maybe was not as focused on the equipment as he would like. And it was interesting to hear Kalmbach's response to that, because he was very diplomatic and very appreciative of Furler's passion and the great photography he was doing, but also, he kind of stuck to his own views of aesthetics and his understanding that readers of the magazine they would want to see the pictures of those Camelback steam locomotives, but they would also want to get a sense for the landscape through which they ran, the towns that they served, the people on them. And that was all part of the story that the Trains magazine was trying to tell. And certainly Dave Morgan, when he became editor, I think even took that to a greater level. And so that was, the publishing tradition, at least, that John Gruber came out of. And John also really looked beyond the rail community, particularly at some of the great photojournalists who were working for some of the newspapers in Milwaukee and Madison in the 1950s and 60s. And so John took that sort of that photojournalistic aesthetic and began applying that to the railroads. But some other photographers, you mentioned Phil Hastings, he was another one, Richard Steinheimer out west, Jim Shaughnessy in the Northeast, David Plowden in the Midwest and much of the country. Who had a great appreciation just for the railroad landscape. And so you started to get these other traditions all coming into railroad photography and kind of advancing the dialogue and the narrative. And then the other big thing that happened was, in the 1950s, diesels replaced steam locomotives all over the country. And the steam locomotive had been that icon of the railroad, of the industrial age. And the locomotives were, they were built in large shops and they were somewhat mass produced, but still each one had its own unique differences and details. And so there was great interest in the locomotives themselves. And each one of those was sort of its own character. And with those gone, you no longer had that, and the diesels were very much mass produced and, they're pretty identical.
And as you know, there have been mergers and consolidations that have happened within the industry over the past 60 years. You know, the paint schemes and even, you know, the colors have been homogenized down to just a few different corporations. And so there are there are far fewer differences in the equipment, and, you know, the infrastructure has become more homogenized, and people began to see this. And especially as the steam locomotives went away, there was this great drive to photograph them before they were gone. But then people were still interested in railroads and still interested in trains, and wanted to find other ways of photographing them. And, you know, the diesels can have some visual appeal, but typically not as much as the steam locomotives do. And so there was, I think, a natural reaction towards more creative photography in general, and you know, a more comprehensive look at the railroad landscape, the people surrounding it, and you know, in a way to still try to capture some of the beauty and the drama of railroading,
right.
But you no longer had that sort of emblem of the steam locomotive to focus on anymore. And so I think in some ways people were forced to look at other ways of dealing with it and approaching it.
That's very interesting. I never thought of that. Now let's bring in the idea of the painter, the visual artist. It also interesting is your supposition that the Hudson River School, etc., the first times that trains are really depicted, it is as an element in a larger landscape.
Right.
So therefore, Charles Sheeler's Rolling Power, which was done in the 30s?
1939.
That would be pretty, that's going to the other direction. That's doing the mechanical side.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, and I'm glad you mentioned it, because that is such a landmark in railroad art, and I think in industrial focused art in general. And it really shows the full sweep that at first, you know, in the 1840s, artists were tentative, and they didn't quite, you know how to reconcile the machine in the garden, you know, to use the title of the great Leo Marx book. You know, how do you reconcile this? How do you approach this in art? And then, you know, in less than 100 years, we have gone from the train being this little thing off in the distance to not only the locomotive, but even just a detail of the locomotive in Rolling Power. And it's, you know, for at least for our railroad viewers watching, I mean, that is it's a detail of a New York Central Hudson locomotive, and it was a streamlined engine that was used to pull the 20th Century Limited. It had fantastic industrial design, but Sheeler did not focus on that streamlining design. He focused on the most raw mechanical elements of the wheels and the connecting rods, and everything about the mechanism that actually made that engine move. And so that's, you know, it's a very tight, you know, profile view of the wheels and rods. And so in less than a century, you'd had, you know, you went from the train being this thing off in the distance to being an object of beauty unto itself. And it's almost ironic to me that we hit that in the fine art world right before steam locomotives were replaced by diesel. So we finally got to the point that they could be approached by artists wholly and unabashedly, and then they were gone, and then we had to figure out something else entirely about how to tackle these you know, the industrial subject of the railroad.
Interesting. Now, Kevin was asking, do we think the trains are a metaphor for freedom, since they open up a possibility of travel and exploration for the masses? My supposition is that trains are a terrific tabula rasa metaphor. You can have them be a metaphor for almost anything. But
absolutely.
What's your take on that? As well, it's certainly for the northern migration from the south up to the industrialization of the north. The train was absolutely. It wasn't even a metaphor for freedom. It was freedom.
No, and you certainly see that in a lot of the music that came out of that era as well. You know, as African Americans were moving north out of the still segregated South and into the industrial jobs in the North, and you had that with westward expansion and migration as well. You know, going back, you know, prior to that, in the you know, once the first transcontinental railroad was finished in 1869. That really helped open up the West, and at least to, you know, to white European civilization. And so, there's that great dichotomy there because, on the one hand, the train is the metaphor for manifest destiny and westward expansion, and American exceptionalism. And then on the other hand, the train was very much the force, helping to drive off native populations, of peoples as well as animals. You had the buffalo herds decimated. You had, American Indians, lives just completely obliterated, and now confined to these little tiny reservations, partially through the geometric order imposed on the West, largely by the railroads.
Right.
But then you had great cities rise out of it with wonderful technological and artistic innovations, and all of this came from the railroad. And so it's one of these things that why, there are certainly aspects of it that aren't great, but why shy away from those? Because the story itself is fascinating, and it's complicated, and it's complex, and it touches lives in so many different ways. And I think it's one of those things that it just becomes more interesting the more deeply and closely you look at it.
Right. I agree entirely. And you're talking about the northern expansion or the northern migration, and talking about Sheeler. It reminds me, you've got a similar strange dichotomy would be Smokestack Lightning, which I believe is Howlin' Wolf, and that's a purely imagistic song. It's about the sparks coming out of a locomotive smokestack at night, but there's no plot to it. It's just imagery. And that's part of the northern migration. And then you have, I would posit, similar to the idea of the Sheeler rolling power piece, you have Steve Goodman's The City of New Orleans, which is about the same north-south route, just going south. And it's getting hagiographic and nostalgic about this train's got the disappearing railroad blues. But it's interesting that we've got the imagistic coming from the untutored, and the very descriptive coming from the educated.
Yes,
fascinating.
Yes.
Fascinating.
It really is.
Sorry, what Bill was putting up? Turner's Rain, Steam, Speed. Yeah, and that's pre-impressionist impressionism.
Yes,
right?
No, that is an utterly spectacular painting. It's one that I always reference anytime I'm talking about railroad art. I mean, it is, and it's interesting to me. I mean, that was 1844, and this is on the Great Western Railway in England. If you haven't seen the painting, just look it up online. It is utterly spectacular. It's a massive oil painting, I think 3 feet by 4 feet, and you have the sort of the diagonal line of the railroad coming at you, and it's this impressionistic sky of a rainstorm in the background, and then there's the little train on the bridge coming towards you, and it's a Firefly locomotive on the Great Western Railway. And the Great Western at the time was built to this broad gauge. The tracks were 7 feet wide, which is
I always thought Turner couldn't paint. I didn't know that. Oh, okay.
And so you have the broad gauge track, 7 feet wide, 2 feet more than 2 feet wider than we have in the U.S. And the trains at that time, think about it. This is 1844. This is 15 years, essentially after the first railroads, and these trains could do over 60 miles an hour. And think about, prior to that, you could go no faster than a horse could run. And now you had the capacity to go a mile a minute. And writers didn't have the language always to express the sensations of this speed. And I'd be interested to hear more what you have to say about Turner in general. But I think that is a spectacular painting that captures this new experience of being able to go so fast across the land. And I think that the painting is wonderful for that diagonal line that shows the straight, direct path of the railroad within this, kind of swirling rainstorm of a landscape all around it.
That's terrific. Thank you for the background on that, because I'm learning so much in this discussion. at the conference last year that I went to, the one I presented at, with 2019, so no, 2 years
2019
ago.
at this
Yeah.
point, yeah.
You had a presentation by a photographer named John Free, who is not viewed as a railroad photographer, and
Right.
that's part of what really impresses me about the center is that you're not just saying these are the icons. John Free, ladies and gentlemen, spent a lot of time photographing the homeless in Los Angeles in the 70s, I think.
Correct.
There were a couple of other photographers doing stuff like that. I remember there was a guy who did a lot of riding. He did a book called Riding the Rails. Michael.
Shoot.
Anyway,
I'll think of it later.
I'll think of it later too. I've got a copy in the other room, but
yes,
anyway,
no,
but John Free did a presentation, and I think he was as surprised as anybody to be at a railroad conference. But he had spent a lot of time in the freight yards around Los Angeles photographing these homeless people. And there's a photograph that I want everybody listening to look up, and Betty Sue has put the link in the comments. It is a photograph, and he told the story of it. This conference is terrific, ladies and gentlemen, and anybody who's even mildly interested in what we're talking about today should go to either the Eastern one, which takes place in Connecticut, I believe, and then or the one out in Chicago. But Free was up there and started kind of tearing up about all of these people that he had photographed, and he described, well, the great Texas songwriter Guy Clark describes his song "She Ain't Going Nowhere" as here's 10 seconds in a young woman's life. And John Free has this photograph of a young woman who has her belongings in a bag next to her. She's facing away from the train. She's sort of facing the photographer. Train is going past. A guy's looking out of the caboose. And on the side of the boxcar, directly behind this young woman, is scrawled, "Jesus saves." And Free said he had no conception that he took this photograph when he took the photograph. It wasn't all set up. You know, he's basically a street photographer, like a Gary Winogrand sort of thing. Right. But it's utterly breathtaking and saddening photograph. He said he talked to the girl and she was 15 years old, had run away from home, you know, and just whatever happened to her. But you know, the breadth of stuff that you've got at this conference, how do you choose? Because it'll go from, you've got young people doing presentations. That's a very conscious part of what you're doing. You do some stuff that is very traditional railroad photography. Then you have a bunch of art, and you've got a bunch, you are doing these photographers who are not necessarily associated directly with the rail field. How do you create all this? What goes into the special sauce?
Well, you know, again, we have just so much phenomenal leadership at the center. We have a conference planning committee that includes several of our board members, myself, a couple of volunteers as well. And we meet several times a year to talk about specifically the lineup for these conferences. And you know, we always sit down and say we have this great embarrassment of riches, because there's just so much great work out there, and it's always really difficult to try to make those decisions of who we're going to invite in a given year. But we really do strive for diversity, you know, at least to the greatest extent that we can in terms of presenters and you know, the media that they're working in, and I'm glad to hear your reactions to that, because I'd say it's very emblematic of what we're trying to do. I mean, certainly we want to give a space for some of the people we would consider to be kind of the grandmaster photographers, you know, within the railroad genre, particularly those that, you know, mid-career or late in their careers, to have that space to really share, you know, the breadth of work that they have done. And, you know, those are often the big names within our field that I think, you know, get people, at least within the railroad community, excited to come. And, you know, so you need those headliners, and they have done some fantastic work. And it's a great place to be able to hear from them directly. And so, we always try to find at least one or two of those to kind of, be the anchors of the conference. And then we look to build,
the headliners of your festival.
Exactly. Yes. And so, before he died, we had Jim Shaughnessy present. We even had Richard Steinheimer before he passed away. David Plowden, still living, has done a couple of presentations, and he is absolutely fantastic.
Yeah.
We were able to have a presentation about Furler, who you mentioned earlier, by his son Alan. So we're certainly looking to have those kinds of presentations at the conference and create space for those people who have spent their entire lives so passionately devoted to photographing railroads to be able to share that work and do so in a meaningful way. I've just named only a few of some of the great ones that we've had there.
One name I wanted to mention before we go, just in terms of railroad art. I had given two names. Traditional railroad art. What I thought I was going to be in the midst of is stuff like Howard Fogg,
Sure.
those are pictures of trains.
Right.
I don't think anyone's going to argue that it is utterly. It's not about the painting. It is about the subject matter. The first artist I ever saw that was, this guy is using, that spoke to me, the first contemporaneous artist that I saw, that it was about what it feels like to look at a train, was Ted Rose.
Yes.
Who is a watercolorist. I actually prefer his early stuff that was a little less specific than he seemed to get later, but utterly an amazing watercolorist. Just captures the feel of the metaphor in front of you. And the center has his photographic collection, right?
We do, yeah. No, and Ted was a fantastic photographer, only active for a few years, and he did his best work in Mexico. He did two extended summer trips during his summer vacations in 1960 and 1961, and photographed the totality of the railroad landscape there, the trains, the people, the land, the places, the light. He got it all, and it is just a breathtaking body of work. And you can really see some of his sensibilities as an artist already emerging. And he was like 20 years old when they did these pictures. And certainly his great talent as I think one of the best railroad artists we've ever had. That was already visible in his photography. We do have a few of his paintings in our collection. Certainly would like to acquire more of those in the future. But yeah, so Ted was someone who kind of, he was a rail fan. He had a great appreciation for the equipment, but at the same time, I think he's someone like you, Charlie, who didn't want to get too caught up in all of the details. And he got the details right to the extent that he was able to get them in watercolor. But for him, it was far more about that experience, about the emotion, about the what it all meant. And he, I think, also like you, has a great appreciation for that north-south, kind of cross-cultural byway that really is sort of symbolic through the Illinois Central Railroad, the city of New Orleans. And Ted grew up in Milwaukee listening to blues being broadcast out of Nashville on 50,000 watts of AM radio when they could crank up the power at night. And that was, I think, just mind-blowing to him. And he developed a deep love of the South and did some wonderful paintings, of Black railroad workers and train riders and those trains going to and from Louisiana and Mississippi and the northern cities. And so, but again, it was capturing those emotions and that and the feeling and the excitement of the trains rather than the details of them themselves.
Yeah.
And there's a strong tradition of literal railroad paintings as well, which really draw on nostalgia, and again, especially with the disappearance of the steam locomotives, with the disappearing railroad blues of all of the great passenger trains, before we had kind of the nationalization of our passenger service under Amtrak. Each railroad had its own passenger service, which had sort of its own culture around it, and there's a lot of fond memories of those. And so there's just been a lot of railroad art that came out of that tradition of kind of capturing these memories that no longer exist. And so I don't mean to belittle that, but and there's been some supremely talented literal painters doing work in that field that continue to. But But it's great to see other people like Ted and then many others who have come after him that have really began, and yourself included, who have really began to embrace kind of the emotional experience of the railroad.
Right. Well, before we go, let's put up, Betty, so if you could put up the book cover of, if people are unfamiliar with railroad photography, I haven't seen this book yet, but I can only imagine that it's probably pretty bitchin'. I initially thought that this was a Plowden photograph, but you say it's Wayne Depperman.
Yes.
But tell us a little about this book and tell us a little about the conferences, and then we will head our way for the day.
Absolutely. Well, so this is the book we're going to be publishing in 2021. It will be out in September. It is also available now for pre-order on our website. And it builds on a concept kind of espoused by David Kaler, one of our board members. He's the vice chair of our board, one of our longest serving board members. He did a previous book called The Railroad and the Art of Place about his own photography.
The one of West Virginia?
Yes, in southern West Virginia, along the Norfolk and Western. And his trips of going there in the 80s and 90s in the dead of winter when the land was bleak and the trains are black and there's no leaves on the trees and there's snow on the ground. And you know, David ran a very successful and highly influential architecture practice in Milwaukee for most of his career. And he brings that architect's eye and artistic sensibilities to his photography. And the way I think architects look at place really comes out in David's photography. And so building on the success, you know, of his vision and doing that book of his own work, we kind of collectively had the idea, well, we have so much great talent within our midst. And this is not a book about train photographs. There are trains in the book, but many of the photographs are devoid of trains and are really more explorations of the railroad landscape and the railroad as a place and the art of that, you know, as we have in the title. And so there's a bunch of different photographers included in this, mainly contemporary. There are some historic images, and there are some portfolios that are looking at specific places. There are some others that look at specific aspects of the railroad landscape. And I think it's just a beautiful exploration of how photographs can get at a sense of place as it's, you know, been built through this industrial subject. And I mean, you see right here on the cover photograph, we have the intersecting lines of the rural road and the railroad cutting across it, the power lines, the railroad crossing signs there extending up into the stormy sky. And, you know, so this is all, I think, parts of what, you know, as photographers we're trying to react to when we're out by the tracks. And, you know, seeing that there's not only the drama of the trains going by, which certainly is very much still there, but that these places have their own character all the time, and that it's worth looking at. You know, right. The great painter Michael Flanagan talks about outlaw landscapes. You know, these places that were, you know, carved out sort of through happenstance by the construction of railroads and factories and other things. You know, these little pockets of land here that still have their own lives and their own character. And I think this book is a beautiful exploration of those. And I tell you, we knew we had great photographers in our midst, but we asked many of them to submit essays to go with us. And we have some really great writers in our midst too. And I think there's some really personal and deeply moving thoughts about what these places mean to some of the people represented in this book and how they're approaching it. So I've only seen it in electronic form so far. We'll get the physical books in, I think, late summer, and I'm sure excited to crack open the wrapper on the first one of those.
Awesome. And so tell us, before we go, just if people are interested in attending conversations, tell us a little bit about how they would learn more.
Well, our website's the place to start, railphoto-art.org. You know, and we would normally be gearing up for normally just be coming off of our annual spring conference, which we are, but it was virtual this year. And right now we are not yet sure what the fall is going to look like. We're following, you know, all of the CDC guidelines and the state of Illinois, and seeing where that's all going to shake out. We hope we will be able to have an in-person event in the fall in the Midwest and somewhere, you know, in the vicinity of Chicago. If we don't, that will be online through the Zoom platform. and we'll have details of that on our website.
Right.
In the meantime, we are doing webinars in the evenings, and we have a really good one, not actually one that we're putting together, but one that we're really excited to help promote. It is a film premiere called Celestials, and it is about the Chinese railroad builders of the Central Pacific and the first transcontinental railroad, done by a man named Barry Fong, who we were very privileged to engage with at our 2019 celebrations and commemorations of that first transcontinental railroad sesquicentennial. And Barry has done this wonderful film that includes interviews from many of the descendants of those Chinese railroad builders that came over here to do some of the really hardest work of building the Central Pacific Railroad up through the Sierra Nevada. And Barry has used these interviews to construct sort of the story of one representative story of what it might have been like for one of those Chinese workers coming over and building the railroad. And that film is going to be premiering on Zoom on Saturday, May 8th, the closest date we could, closest Saturday to the May 10th transcontinental Golden Spike anniversary. And Barry will be available for a talk back that'll be broadcast after that. And so there's details about that on our website as well. No fees for that, but we do. We normally encourage donations to us, but for this one, we encourage donations to the Chinese American Historical Society out in California that Barry partnered with on this project, and it's really, really a fantastic look at, I think, an often overlooked and underrepresented part of the Transcontinental Railroad story, and just some really wonderful interviewing and visual storytelling that Barry's done on that. And then we do have a couple of other weeknight evening programs scheduled throughout the summer that'll be coming later in May and into June and July that I think will also be well worth tuning into, and those will all be available off of our website for details on those as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for taking the time, Scott.
Oh, Charlie, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Well, terrific. And I hope people who are interested will consider joining the center and being participatory in this, because you're doing great stuff, and I think it's just really exciting. So thank you so much. Thank you, Betty Sue, and thank you all for watching. Bye-bye.
Thanks for tuning in. Thanks, Charlie.